leaving Pak Sutanto facing angry workers demanding the wages they are owed, all while his mother's health spirals downward and medical costs skyrocket. In the middle of this storm appears Dimas, a former nobody whose life was once changed by one simple act of kindness from Sutanto years ago, and now, by some twist of fate and hard work, he's become an important figure in Grup Laksana, another large business group that's better placed to survive in this brutal modern economy. Out of deep gratitude, he offers to help Sutanto land on his feet by joining forces with Grup Laksana, and this leads them into a high-stakes chip technology competition organized by Grup Simmering, where rival companies bid for a strategic partnership that could reshape Indonesia's position in the global tech industry. While Sutanto and his new allies hustle to win that contract, the legal system slowly closes in on Sanjaya and the others who participated in the betrayal, pulling them into the harsh light of justice as their carefully built lies start to crumble. That's the broad shape of it, but that summary doesn't capture just how emotionally crushing and strangely uplifting this film is to actually watch, because none of these events are handled like plot checkboxes. They are presented through very human, very grounded scenes that feel like they could be happening to your neighbor, or your uncle, or to that kind older boss you once had. From here on out, I'm going fully into spoiler territory. Because to really talk about why Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas works, we have to walk through the betrayals, the desperation, and the quiet, stubborn hope that runs underneath everything like a thin, persistent melody. Early in the movie, there's a scene that, for me, sets the emotional tone for the entire story. Pak Sutanto is at a modest warung with one of his senior employees, an older man named Harun, who has worked at Grup Perkasa since the beginning. Harun mentions in passing that his daughter has just been accepted into a university, but he's worried about tuition, and we see that classic Indonesian dance, the way Harun tries to say it's fine, that he'll manage, that he doesn't want to burden his boss, and the way Sutanto listens quietly, then opens his old leather wallet and slips some bills into Harun's hand, making a light joke to diffuse the gravity of the moment, something like, "Consider it an early graduation bonus," and Harun's eyes well up because he knows this is not just money, it's another piece of evidence that he chose the right man to follow for all these years. The camera doesn't cut away, it stays on their faces, the awkward gratitude, the embarrassed generosity, and it's in small moments like that where the film plants the seed of its main idea. Kindness is never wasted, it's stored somewhere, in the hearts of people, in memories that you don't even know still exist, and someday, somehow, it might return to you. In harsh contrast, we meet the adopted children, and the writing is smart enough not to make them cartoon villains, at least not at first. They are not just greedy monsters, they are complicated, flawed people shaped by a lifetime of never really knowing where they truly belong. There's Raka, the eldest, who feels that no matter how hard he works, he still lives in the shadow of Sutanto's stories about the early days, about the biological son who died young, about the sacrifices he made when he was young and poor. Then there's Myra, sharp-tongued and restless, who loves luxury and hates being reminded that it was all given, not earned, and Yuti, the youngest, quiet and easily influenced, always trying to prove he deserves the surname he carries. The film shows them rolling their eyes when their father gives money to an employee again, or when he insists on keeping an unprofitable old division of the company running, for the sake of the workers. And you can feel their frustration building. From their point of view, they see a man who is no longer being a responsible businessman, who is throwing away their inheritance in the name of some moral code that doesn't seem to fit the ruthless 2020s, and into that simmering resentment walks Sanjaya. Now, Sanjaya is introduced with such calculated precision that you immediately know, oh, this man is trouble, but the film doesn't shout it at you, it shows it. He's the kind of guy who always looks a little too perfect, ties always on point, smile always practiced, words always just flattering enough, and he's presented as a long-time collaborator of Grup Perkasa, someone involved in their financial and investment strategies, which means he has access, knowledge, and just enough distance to claim he's acting in the best interests of the company while actually steering it somewhere very specific. The scenes where he gently, almost lovingly, poisons the minds of Sutanto's children are some of the film's most chilling moments, not because he raises his voice or threatens anyone, but because he wraps his manipulation in the language of concern and modern wisdom. He points out how volatile the market is, how competitors are acquiring, how outdated some of Grup Perkasa's systems are, and he frames Sutanto's generosity as a dangerous weakness, something that could sink the company and leave the children with nothing. He shows them numbers on a tablet, projections, graphs that look very convincing, and in hushed private meetings he starts to sell them on a necessary restructuring, which is actually a carefully planned coup. What I particularly appreciate about Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is how it doesn't absolve the adopted children by making Sanjaya some kind of evil hypnotist. No, they are tempted because there's something inside them already restless, already impatient, and he just presses on that bruise. By the time the coup happens, a scene staged in a brutally tense board meeting where papers are shuffled, legal documents are read in flat voices, and Sutanto realizes, too late, that the signatures on those documents are his children's. We understand exactly how they got there. We may not forgive it, but we understand. That scene is devastating, not because it's loud, but because of how quiet it is. The moment when he looks across the polished table, meets the eyes of the children he raised, and sees not guilt or sorrow, but a kind of defensive coldness, like they've already convinced themselves this is for the best, for the survival of the company, for the future. Raka avoids his gaze. Myra stares back almost defiantly. Yudi's hands shake slightly but he says nothing, and then Sanjaya, always the polished mediator, phrases it in a way that sounds almost reasonable, talking about responsibility, about modernizing, about stepping aside. The fallout is brutal. The restructuring is really just a veil for asset stripping, loans taken in the company's name, funds siphoned off, risky investments that benefit shell companies connected to Sanjaya's network, and the house of cards collapses with horrifying speed. One day we see employees laughing in the canteen, the next we see them clustered in front of the main office, holding envelopes, their faces blank as they read the words that confirm what they've been fearing. Grup Perkasa is bankrupt, but the movie doesn't show this as a big news montage. It takes us inside that crowd, into the anger and desperation, the man shouting that he has a baby at home, the woman crying because she has no idea how she'll pay her rent, and someone, voice trembling, calls out, Mana Tanggung Jawab Pak Sutanto, and that question cuts deeper than any insult, because responsibility has been the core of his life, his whole identity, and now his people feel abandoned, even though he's been betrayed just as they have. There's a haunting scene where he tries to address them, standing on the small steps in front of the building, his voice lost in the noise of the crowd, promising that he will find a way to pay at least part of their unpaid wages, that he won't run away. And you can see in his eyes he doesn't yet know how he's going to keep that promise, but he makes it anyway, because that's who he is. And as if that isn't enough pressure, the film keeps cutting to the hospital, to his mother's room, where the beeping of machines forms a cruel counterpoint to the numbers on the red ink side of his ledgers. She's getting worse, and every extra night in that hospital burns through more money he no longer has. It's at this lowest point, when he's selling his car, moving out of his comfortable house, pawning jewelry, doing anything he can to scrape together enough to cover partial wages and medical bills, that Dimas appears in the story like a ghost from a completely different life. When we first see Dimas, he's in a very different world, sleek boardrooms, big city skyline, cutting-edge presentations about chip technology, the future of Indonesia's place in a global supply chain that's normally dominated by giants from the US, China, Korea, and Taiwan, and he seems completely at home there, confident, articulate, respected, but there's something in the way he listens when someone mentions Grup Perkasa's collapse on the news, a flicker in his eyes, a pause in his breath, and then we get one of the film's most quietly powerful flashbacks. Years earlier, Dimas was just a teenage kid selling bottled drinks on a hot street corner near one of Perkasa's old factory sites, hustling day by day, dirt under his nails, no clear path out of his circumstances. One afternoon, there's a minor incident, maybe he bumps into someone important by accident, or gets accused of loitering where he's not wanted, and it's Sutanto, younger, less wrinkled but with the same calm eyes, who intervenes, pays for the broken bottles, tells the security guard to relax, and instead of brushing the boy off, he asks him his name, his story, and eventually, impressed by the boy's determination, offers him a small scholarship, a chance to continue his education, a job in the warehouse on weekends. It's nothing huge for a businessman of his scale, just a gesture. But for Dimas it's the moment that changes everything, the door that opens his future. The film doesn't oversell it, it doesn't make it melodramatic, it's just a simple, almost throwaway act of decency that ripples forward in time. And that's where the title really begins to resonate. Kindness of heart is worth gold, because years later, that skinny kid is now a key figure in Grup Laksana, and when he sees the man who once helped him now being torn apart by scandal and poverty, he can't just sit back. There's a brilliant scene where Dimas tracks Sutanto down, not in an office, not in some fancy place, but in a cramped rented room where he's staying near the hospital, the paint peeling, the fan squeaking overhead, Sutanto opens the door, in worn clothes, his shoulders slightly hunched, but still trying to keep that dignified politeness, and for a moment he doesn't recognize the man at his door, standing there in a tailored suit. When he realizes who it is, there's this small gasp, a flash of something like shame mixed with pride, shame that Demas is seeing him at his lowest, pride that this former street kid has made it this far. Demas doesn't waste time with empty platitudes. He kneels slightly, looks his old benefactor in the eye, and says, "Pak, dulu bapak pakaya sama soya waktu tidak ada orang lain yang peduli. Sekarang giliran soya yang harus pakaya sama bapak." And that line hit me so hard, because it flips the narrative we're so used to, where the powerful always save the weak. Here, the man who used to be powerful is now fragile, and the boy he helped has become the lifeline. Demas proposes that Sutanto join Grup Laksana in a joint venture, bringing his experience, his understanding of certain industrial sectors, and his reputation, still intact among many, into a new project that Grup Laksana is preparing, competing in a high-stakes chip technology competition organized by Grup Simmering. And this is where the narrative broadens from a personal story to something more national, almost geopolitical, but it never loses the emotional core, because at every step, the chip competition is framed not as some abstract tech war, but as a chance for redemption, a way for Sutanto to pay his debts to his workers, to restore his honor, to prove that his way of doing business, with a heart, is not obsolete. The competition itself is an interesting device. Grup Simmering, a massive conglomerate with international partnerships, has opened a race for Indonesian players to propose and develop a strategic chip solution. Think advanced microchips necessary for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles, and the winner secures a contract that will bring in huge revenue, international visibility, and long-term stability. Multiple groups are competing, each bringing their own strategy. And, in a bitter twist, one of those rival camps turns out to be backed by Sanjaya and some of the same financial vultures who feasted on Grup Perkasa's carcass, putting betrayal and justice on a direct collision course. Visually, the film uses the chip competition to shift gears. We move from the browns and greys of bankruptcy and hospital corridors into bright, cool-toned labs, blue-lit server rooms, neon reflections on glass walls. And the tension here isn't expressed through gunfights or car chases, but through late-night brainstorming sessions, heated debates over ethical shortcuts, and the ethics of accepting certain investors. What I really loved is how the film doesn't suddenly turn Sutanto into some tech genius. He's out of his depth when people start talking about nanometers and fabrication processes, but his value lies elsewhere, in his ability to read people, to manage teams, to keep morale steady under pressure, and especially in his insistence that the project not cut corners in labor practices or environmental impact, even when those principles seem like they might cost them the win. This stands in purposeful contrast to Sanjaya's camp, which embraces every shortcut, from exploiting cheap unregulated labor to quietly trying to steal data from competitors. The movie gives us a tense sequence where there's a suspected data breach in Grup Laksana's servers, a midnight scramble to secure their designs, the team's suspicion that someone inside has been compromised, and through it all, Sutanto remains this calm center, reminding everyone that fear and paranoia will only tear them apart from the inside. While the chip storyline builds, the legal consequences of the earlier betrayal begin to unfold parallel to it. One of the most satisfying arcs in the entire film belongs not to one of the main corporate players, but to a mid-ranking investigator in the financial crimes unit, a woman named Rani, who quietly, methodically pieces together the dirty trail left by Sanjaya and his associates. We see her sorting through boxes of documents salvaged from Grup Perkasa's office, interviewing clerks, tracing missing funds through a maze of shell companies, and the film gives her enough screen time that when the arrest warrants finally come down, it doesn't feel like some deus ex machina. It feels earned, like justice that's been painstakingly built, line by line, bank transfer by bank transfer. Sanjaya's downfall is portrayed in a way that's almost anticlimactic on purpose. There's no big shouting match, no dramatic public arrest in the middle of a fancy gala. Instead, he's picked up early one morning, half-dressed, his hair still messy, as officers stand politely but firmly in his doorway. His smooth words fail him for once, his rehearsed charm crumbles when confronted with thick files and cold evidence. And there's this moment where you can see in his eyes that he's trying to calculate his way out, to find an angle, but the walls have finally closed in. Later, we see him in a courtroom, the immaculate suits replaced by a plain shirt, reading a prepared apology that sounds empty, mechanical, utterly disconnected from the real damage he caused. In contrast, the fate of the adopted children is handled with much more emotional nuance. They are also held accountable legally, to varying degrees, for signing certain documents, for benefiting from ill-gotten gains, but the film doesn't delight in their punishment. It presents it as a tragic waste, showing Myra visiting her old house, now sold, standing outside the gate as if she's been exiled from a place that was never truly hers but was the only home she knew. Raka tries to find work elsewhere and realizes that his reputation is tainted, that the business world he wanted to rule has a long memory, and Yudi, haunted by guilt, writes a letter to Sutanto that he doesn't have the courage to send yet. Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is very smart in not tying these arcs up too neatly, because in real life, remorse and forgiveness are messy, ongoing processes, not a single tearful scene that fixes everything. Speaking of forgiveness, one of the film's emotional climaxes doesn't happen in a boardroom or a lab, but in a hospital room, as we always knew it would. Sutanto's mother becomes the quiet emotional spine of the movie, and her health acts almost like a barometer of his spiritual state. As his life crumbles, she weakens. As he begins to find a path forward, a flicker of hope returns to her eyes. There's a heartbreaking sequence where he sits by her bed, late at night, the rhythmic beep of the monitors filling the silence, and he confesses everything. How he failed to see the betrayal coming, how he feels stupid for trusting too much, how he's ashamed that the workers he always swore to protect are now standing in front of his house asking for money he can't give, and she, with the wisdom of someone who has lived through too much to be impressed by success or devastated by failure, tells him that true kindness is not a transaction, it's not an investment you make expecting a return, and that if he is paying the price for his good heart now, it doesn't mean that heart was worthless. She says something along the lines of, Emas itu dibentuk dengan API, nak. Mungkin sekarang hatimu lagi dibakar, gold is shaped with fire, maybe now your heart is just being burned into its true form, and that metaphor, resonating with the film's title, ties together his suffering and his values into something almost sacred. So you have these intimate, raw scenes of personal pain, and then you have the big, almost operatic tension of the chip competition reaching its peak. Presentation day at Grup Semelang, the different teams file into a sleek auditorium. Judges from government, academia, and industry sit behind long tables, and the air is thick with anticipation. We see glimpses of the other pitches, some focus on speed, others on cost efficiency, some clearly relying on foreign IP disguised as local innovation, and then it's Dimas and Sutanto's turn. If this were a lesser movie, this would be the moment where some flashy twist happens, like a dramatic hack revealed on a big screen or some last-minute discovery that the rival's chip is flawed, but Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas opts for something more grounded. The tension comes from whether their vision, which balances cutting-edge tech with ethical labor practices and a realistic roadmap for local capacity building, will be deemed good enough. In a world obsessed with short-term profit, Dimas handles the technical part, speaking confidently about architecture, fabrication partnerships, long-term sustainability, while Sutanto, in a simple suit that's clearly not new, steps up for the final segment and talks, from the heart, about trust. He doesn't bore the judges with more numbers, they've already seen the projections. Instead, he talks about what it means for Indonesia to not only build chips, but to build an industry culture that doesn't treat people as disposable, that sees its workers not as mere line items but as the foundation. He acknowledges his own failures, the bankruptcy, the people he couldn't pay on time, and he pledges that this new project is his attempt, maybe his last, to do it right. The room is silent as he speaks, not because everyone is instantly convinced, but because you can feel the weight of lived experience behind his words. The film wisely doesn't show the results immediately. It cuts away to other threads, to the courtroom, to the workers who have now found odd jobs elsewhere but still watch the news, to Rani signing off on another set of documents in the financial crimes office, to Dimas's team nervously waiting in a corridor. When the announcement finally comes, it's not some triumphant, slow-motion parade. It's a simple message popped into a group chat, a news alert popping up on screens. Grup Laksana and its partners, including the division led by Sutanto and Dimas, have been awarded the strategic cooperation contract by Grup Semelang, and in that moment, there's this collective exhale, a release of breath you didn't know you were holding. For Sutanto, it's less a moment of victory than a moment of relief. He closes his eyes, not to celebrate, but to whisper a quiet thank you, to God, to fate, to whatever forces allowed this sliver of redemption. Later, we see him starting to repay his debts, not in some montage where everything is fixed overnight, but in small, incremental payments, visiting former employees in person to hand them the money he owes, even when some of them have moved on and don't really expect to see a cent. Some greet him with tears, others with awkward politeness, a few with lingering resentment, and the film doesn't shy away from showing that kindness does not always guarantee you a warm reception, but you can see in his eyes that for him, this is not about how they respond, it's about fulfilling his promise, about closing a circle. Cinematically, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is a quietly beautiful film, not the kind that assaults you with stylized shots every 2 seconds, but one that carefully uses color, framing, and sound to underline its emotional beats. Early in the film, the world of Grup Perkasa is shot in slightly warmer tones, golden hour light spilling into offices, making everything feel like a long, comfortable late afternoon, a golden age slowly fading. After the betrayal, the palette cools, blues and grays dominate, the lighting is harsher, shadows deeper, as if the warmth has literally been drained out of his world. In the hospital scenes, light filters through thin curtains in soft, diffused beams, sometimes almost overexposed, creating an ethereal, fragile atmosphere, and in the chip competition sequences, there's a sleek, almost sterile look, glass, metal, reflections, neon accents, emphasizing how cold and impersonal that high-tech world can feel. But every time Dimas and Sutanto stand together, whether in a cramped room or a fancy conference hall, the camera catches some small, warm detail, the glint of sunlight on their faces, the warm hue of a wooden table amidst all the chrome, as if visually reminding us that human connection is the real centerpiece of the story. The score deserves a mention too, a blend of traditional Indonesian instruments with modern, minimalistic electronic textures, subtle and restrained, but incredibly effective. There are sequences where a single reverb note or a gentle gamelan pattern underpins a crucial dialogue scene, grounding all this modern corporate drama in a distinctly local emotional register, reminding you this is not some generic global business story. This is Indonesian, with all the cultural particularities that implies, the importance of family, the weight of bakti to parents, the unspoken hierarchies in offices, the way shame and honor are negotiated quietly behind closed doors. Performance-wise, the actor playing Pak Sutanto absolutely carries the film. There's a softness in his eyes that never leaves, even when he's angry or devastated, and that contradiction, the coexistence of strength and vulnerability, makes him feel incredibly real. There's a scene where he's confronted by reporters outside a courthouse during the investigations into Grup Perkasa's collapse, microphones shoved in his face, accusations flying, and he doesn't shout or storm off, he just stands there, absorbing every word. Then says, in a voice that's almost too calm, "Saya yang bertanggung jawab, I am the one responsible," and you can feel how much it costs him to say that, not because he's avoiding blame for the betrayal, but because he's taking on guilt even for things that weren't really his fault. And this habit of absorbing others' sins, of refusing to throw his children fully under the bus even when they've destroyed him, becomes both his noblest trait and his tragic flaw. The actor who plays Dimas gives us a very different energy, younger, faster, moving through scenes with the kinetic urgency of someone who has had to fight for every inch of progress in his life. But when he's with Sutanto, he slows down, he listens, his body language shifts subtly from confident executive to grateful son, and their chemistry sells the core emotional premise of the film, that found family can sometimes be more faithful than family by blood. Sanjaya's actor has the difficult task of embodying a man who is at once charismatic and utterly hollow, and he nails it with these tiny expressions. The way his eyes go flat when someone turns away, the way his smile doesn't reach the upper half of his face, and by the time he's facing sentencing, sitting in that courtroom looking small and ordinary, you almost feel a twinge of pity, not because you think he doesn't deserve it, but because you realize how limited his worldview always was, how he could never see beyond money and power to the things that actually endure. In terms of pacing, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is not a fast film, and that might be a problem for some viewers expecting a tight corporate thriller, but for me, the deliberate pace is part of its emotional power. The first act lingers, maybe a little too long for impatient eyes, in the routines of Sutanto's daily life, the board meetings, the family dinners, the hospital visits, but that lull is necessary. You have to feel the texture of the world before you can really feel the loss when it's taken away. The second act, dealing with the fallout of betrayal and the setup with Grup Laksana, moves more briskly, the narrative cross-cutting between financial collapse, family confrontation, and Dimas's rise. The third act, where the chip competition and the legal reckoning run in parallel, is the most tightly edited portion, with tension building as both battles approach their respective verdicts. If I had to criticize anything, I'd say there are a few supporting characters, some of Demas's team members, a couple of the investigators, who feel like they could have been developed a bit more, but their relative simplicity doesn't significantly detract from the core emotional arc, which remains laser-focused on Sutanto, his fall, and his quiet resurrection. Thematically, this film is a treasure trove, and it's been fascinating to watch how different audiences latch onto different aspects of it. Some people see it primarily as a morality tale about ingratitude, about children who forget the hand that fed them, and there's certainly a lot of juice there. Indonesian social media was full of comments like, "Jangan jadi anak kayak gitu," and "Ini pelajaran buat semua yang lupa diri." But what struck me more strongly was the film's commentary on how kindness operates in an economic system that is, frankly, not built for it. We see again and again that Sutanto's refusal to cut people off, to fire workers at the first sign of downturn, to close unprofitable units that still give people livelihoods, all of that makes him weak in the eyes of modern business logic, and in a way, the film doesn't deny that. It shows how those choices put him in vulnerable positions, how they made him an easy target for someone like Sanjaya. The message is not some naive, just be kind and everything will magically work out. It's more complex. Be kind anyway, even knowing you might be hurt. But also be wise, build systems that protect both your heart and your people. And then there's the theme of gratitude, which is embodied not by the adopted children, but by Demas. In many stories, the biological or adopted children are the obvious heirs, the ones meant to carry on the legacy. But here, it's the outsider, the kid from the street to whom Sutanto once gave a chance, who ultimately fulfills that role. That inversion becomes a kind of quiet indictment of entitlement. Those who grow up in comfort often see kindness as a given, a baseline, something they are owed, while those who receive it as a rare, unexpected gift hold it like a treasure for life. This resonates strongly with cultural values around balas budi, the idea of repaying kindness, which is still powerful in Indonesian society even as urbanization and modern capitalism chip away at communal bonds. Many viewers talked about how Demas reminded them of stories their parents or grandparents told them about people who never forgot a favor from decades ago, and how that kind of long memory gratitude feels rarer now. The film taps into that nostalgia without becoming regressive, because it situates this ancient moral code in a very contemporary setting. Chip fabs, venture capital, financial crime units. It says, in effect, yes, the world has changed, but the fundamental currency of human decency still holds its value. Culturally, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas made waves not so much because of box office numbers, though it did quite well, but because of the discussions it sparked. People debated whether Sutanto was too soft, whether he should have pressed charges against his own children more aggressively, whether forgiveness without boundaries is just enabling further harm. Others focused on the systemic angle, drawing parallels between the fictional Grup Perkasa and real-life cases of corporate sabotage and mismanagement in Indonesia, pointing out how often it's the workers who bear the brunt of elite greed. Then there were the memes, because of course there were screenshots of Sanjaya smiling with captions like, Timan yang bilang, you cuma mau bantu, or clips of the Warung scene with text overlays about, Timan yang selalu rakta makan pa lagi bokek, humor and heartbreak entwined as only internet culture can manage. But beyond the jokes and the hot takes, what stayed with many viewers, and with me, was that final emotional trajectory. A man stripped of almost everything who discovers that the one thing he refused to compromise on, his kindness, is the one thing that ends up saving him, not in a fairy tale way where all the villains are vanquished and life becomes perfect, but in a grounded, bittersweet way that feels honest. By the time the film ends, we see Sutanto not as the triumphant head of a new empire, but as a man in a modest but solid position at Grup Laksana, a contributor, a respected elder, visiting his mother's grave with Demas at his side, placing simple white flowers on the soil. He talks to her softly, updating her on what's happened, telling her that he's been able to repay much of what he owed, that some of the workers' kids are now studying in good schools thanks to new scholarship programs he helped design. There's a faint smile as he says he's still too soft, still too quick to help, and he hears her words in his memory, that gold is formed in fire. Behind him, off in the distance, we glimpse the new chip fabrication plant under construction, cranes and scaffolding outlined against a golden late afternoon sky, and the symbolism is almost too perfect but somehow earned. From ashes to circuits, from betrayal to renewed purpose, from a heart broken to a heart refined, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is not a flawless film, nothing is, but it's a deeply sincere one. And in a cinematic landscape increasingly crowded with ironic detachment and spectacle for spectacle's sake, its earnestness feels almost radical. It asks us to feel, to sit in discomfort, to watch a good man be hurt over and still choose to be good, not because he's a saint, but because he doesn't know how to be anything else, and it challenges us to examine our own relationship to kindness, gratitude, and responsibility. When the credits roll, you might find yourself not thinking about chip architectures or court verdicts, but about that one teacher who believed in you, that neighbor who helped your family when money was tight, that boss who gave you a chance when your CV was basically empty, or perhaps about whether you've become more like Sanjaya than you'd like to admit, making every decision through the lens of pure self-interest. And as a piece of storytelling, as a cinematic experience, it stays with you, because it knows that the most explosive drama doesn't come from car chases or shootouts, but from a parent looking into a child's eyes and realizing they've become a stranger. From an old friend knocking on your door when you thought the world had forgotten you, from a crowd of workers who, years later, show up not to demand, but to say thank you. That's the final grace note the film gives us in its epilogue. One evening, in the fading light, some of the former Grup Percaser employees, now working at the new plant or in other jobs, gather quietly outside Sutanto's simple new home, not in anger this time, but in gratitude. They bring food, they bring laughter, and they bring stories of how that one extra month of salary he managed to scrape together got them through a crisis, how his recommendation letter landed them a job. He steps outside, surprised, overwhelmed, and for a moment he doesn't know where to put his hands, what to say, and then he just laughs, that tired but genuine laugh of someone who has been through hell and somehow made it out with his soul intact, and in that sound, in that small, human moment, the film's thesis crystallizes. A good heart may not shield you from suffering, but it leaves behind something priceless in other people's lives, something that can outlast companies, fortunes, and even your own life. And if a movie can make you feel all of that, if it can send you back into your own reality with your senses a little sharper to the quiet kindness around you, then it's done something extraordinary, something that's worth talking about, worth remembering, and worth recommending. So, if you haven't seen Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas yet, I hope this deep dive has given you a taste of its emotional landscape without spoiling the specific textures and nuances that make it special. And if you have seen it, I hope it helped you process why it hit so hard, why certain scenes won't leave your mind, and why a simple phrase like Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas now feels heavy with meaning. As for me, I'm left with one question to you listening right now, as you sit wherever you are, with your own history of kindness given and received. There are movies that entertain you, movies that pass through your mind like a breeze, and then there are movies that sit with you, quietly, like a memory you didn't know you had, a story that feels almost too close to real life, too painful and too beautiful at the same time. And Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas, this 2025 Indonesian drama about betrayal, resilience, and the quiet power of gratitude, is exactly that kind of film. The kind that doesn't just fill 2 hours of your day but lingers in your chest long after the credits roll, like a moral echo asking, if kindness has a price, what would you be willing to pay for it? And as we sink into this emotional, layered, and surprisingly cinematic journey of Pak Sutanto, a man whose world is shattered not by strangers, not by fate, but by the very people he once called family, it becomes clear that this isn't just a corporate drama, not just about business rivalry and chip technology. This is a story about human hearts under pressure. Before we plunge deeper into this story of broken trust, redemption, and second chances, let me just say this, before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I want to know from which corner of the world you are sharing this emotional journey with me. And now, let's walk into the world of Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas together, like we're stepping into a long, winding hallway of memories, each door revealing a piece of a man who gave everything, and had everything taken away in return, at least for a while. Now, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas, released in 2025, comes at an interesting time for Indonesian cinema, a time when we're seeing more and more stories that blend traditional values with modern conflicts. And this film is deeply rooted in that tension, because it takes what could easily have been a straight corporate thriller, chip technology, business groups, tech competitions, and anchors it in something far more intimate and emotional, the love of a foster father for his adopted children, the weight of an aging mother's illness, the desperate responsibility of a man who knows that behind every unpaid salary is a family that needs to eat, and layered on top of that, the brutal sting of betrayal at the hands of those he raised, mentored, trusted, and ultimately empowered. The movie opens with an atmosphere that feels almost deceptively calm. We see the name Grup Perkasa glowing proudly on a gleaming office building. We see employees walking through the lobby with a sense of purpose. We see Pak Sutanto, played with heartbreaking sincerity by an actor who doesn't need big gestures to move you, moving through his day like a quiet anchor in the middle of this buzzing ecosystem, greeting his workers, nodding to the receptionist, sharing a soft smile with the cleaning staff. And it's here, in these tiny, almost mundane moments, that the film first plants the seed of its central question: what does it mean to be good in a world that rewards ambition more than empathy? A world where kindness is often seen as weakness, where gratitude is not a guarantee but a fragile hope. It's not long before that calm begins to crack, and the script smartly sets up hints of tension lurking beneath the surface. A short but loaded boardroom scene where the adopted children of Pak Sutanto, who are now high-ranking figures in Grup Perkasa, exchange glances that feel just slightly too cold, too calculating, while business talks about technology, expansion, and partnerships begin to hint at widening philosophical divides, because on one side you have Sutanto, thinking about the livelihoods of his workers, about long-term sustainability, about ethics, and on the other side you have his foster children and Sanjaya, one of the new forces in the company, hungry for rapid growth and power, impatient with what they see as old-fashioned morality holding them back. The film isn't in a rush to throw the word betrayal at you. It lets you feel it first, and that's what makes it so painful later. When the rug is finally pulled, early on, there is a quiet scene at home, with Sutanto taking care of his sick mother, her frail hand clutching his, the room lit by the sad, pale light of a bedside lamp, and she tells him something that becomes a kind of moral thread for the entire movie, something like, "Nak, harta itu bisa habis, tapi kebaikan hati itu, nilainya emas," loosely, child. Wealth can be lost, but goodness of heart, that is worth gold, and the film wisely uses that line not as a cheesy tagline but as a haunting echo, returning in moments where characters are forced to make choices that weigh survival against integrity, revenge against forgiveness, comfort against sacrifice. Story-wise, the big turning point comes when we realize just how deep the betrayal goes, and it's not just about an argument over business decisions. It's systematic, premeditated, and shockingly cold. As documents are forged, accounts are manipulated, deals are secretly redirected, and we begin to see that Sanjaya and some of the children Sutanto raised have been carefully building a web to slowly squeeze him out of his own empire, stripping him of control, tarnishing his name, and ultimately driving Grup Perkasa into bankruptcy while shielding themselves from the fallout. And emotionally, this doesn't play like a twist-heavy thriller where you're just waiting for the next plot reveal. It plays like watching someone you love slowly realize that the people they'd die for would not only refuse to save them but might actually be the ones holding their head underwater. There's a devastating sequence when Sutanto stands alone in what used to be his office, after the announcement of bankruptcy, the walls half empty, the once busy phone silent, and the camera lingers on his face as a wave of realization hits him. It's not just the company that collapsed, it's a lifetime of trust, and at the exact same time, his personal life is crumbling too, because back at home his mother's health is deteriorating, the hospital bills are piling up, and outside those glass office doors, a sea of workers, people who have spent years, some decades, dedicating their lives to something they believed was stable, are standing there, wondering if they will get their salaries, wondering how they will feed their families now that Grup Perkasa is nothing but a name left on documents. And the film does something very smart here. It doesn't rush to show them as angry protesters right away. Instead it shows them as people in shock, murmurs, confused questions, hopeful eyes turning to Sutanto like he can somehow fix this, even though we, as the audience, know that he himself is barely staying afloat. This is where the emotional weight of the story really begins to press down, because Sutanto is caught in a moral vice. He has every right to collapse, to break down, to disappear, but he feels responsible, not just legally, not just financially, but almost like a father who feels guilty for failing to protect his family from a storm, even if he didn't cause the storm. And then, like a kind of mirror image to all the betrayal, the film introduces Demas, a character whose presence feels like a warm hand extended in the darkness, and the reveal of his connection to Sutanto is done in a way that feels earned, not forced, because we learn that long ago, when Demas was struggling, when he was a nobody with an idea and a pile of problems, it was Sutanto who stepped in, quietly, without fanfare, to help him, to support him, possibly giving him that first break or that critical financial lifeline that allowed him to become the man he is now. A key figure in Grup Laksana, a powerful and rising competitor in the tech world, and now, when the rest of the world is turning its back on Sutanto, when his own foster children have sold him out, it is Dimas who comes back, not out of obligation, not as a savior archetype, but as a man who remembers kindness, who was changed by it, and sees this as his moment to give back something that can never quite be repaid but must be attempted. Visually, the contrast between the collapse of Grup Perkasa and the introduction of Grup Laksana is almost poetic, where Perkasa's scenes are washed in cold, desaturated tones, empty offices, and echoing hallways. Laksana is introduced with bright, clean spaces, warm lighting, and a sense of organized, purposeful energy, and when Dimas invites Sutanto into this world, asking him to join forces, bringing him into Laksana not as a pity case but as a respected potential ally, you can feel this shift, this tiny crack of light in the thick moral fog of the story. The heart of the second act revolves around this partnership, and around the idea of rebuilding from the ashes, not by becoming ruthless, not by mirroring the betrayal he experienced, but by holding on, sometimes tightly, sometimes almost desperately, to the belief that goodness, sincerity, and competence still have a place in a cutthroat industry. And the film uses the upcoming technology chip competition, organized by yet another major player, Grup Symbolism, as the arena where all these emotional and moral stakes will play out. This is where the corporate narrative and the emotional narrative finally merge. The competition isn't just about innovation anymore, it's not just about who can design the best chip, it's about dignity, it's about redemption, it's about whether a man who has lost everything can stand up again and prove, to himself as much as to the world, that what happened to him will not define the rest of his life. The chip competition scenes have a different energy than the rest of the film. They're tense, yes, but not in a glossy Hollywood tech thriller kind of way, more like watching a team of underdogs trying to outrun the weight of their own past, working late nights, dealing with technical breakdowns, facing internal doubts, and all the while in the background there's still that storm of unresolved issues, the unpaid employees waiting for justice, the legal investigations slowly circling around the collapse of Grup Perkasa, Sanjaya and his allies scheming to secure their positions, or perhaps even sabotage Sutanto's attempt at a comeback. What makes this competition storyline compelling is not just that Sutanto and his team at Grup Laksana eventually win, because yes, they do. They manage to outshine their rivals and secure that strategic partnership with Grup Symbolism, but how they get there emotionally, because the victory isn't simply portrayed as a triumph of intellect or resources, it's framed as the result of integrity, teamwork, and a kind of moral clarity that grows out of suffering, as if losing everything stripped away the noise and left only what truly matters, building something honest, something that doesn't stand on the broken backs of others. There is a quiet but powerful moment before the final presentation of their chip design, where Sutanto turns to the team and says something along the lines of, "No matter what happens out there, we did this the right way," and you can feel that for him. This moment is less about beating his enemies and more about proving to himself that he didn't let their betrayal corrupt him, that he didn't allow their darkness to drag him down to their level. And while all of this is unfolding on the surface, the film doesn't forget the backbone of its emotional landscape, the legal reckoning that slowly but surely begins to close in around Sanjaya and his co-conspirators. Instead of a sudden, dramatic arrest montage, the story lets the legal process unfold with a sense of inevitability, like gravity doing its slow, patient work, conversations with lawyers, evidence being pieced together, former allies turning into witnesses, and in the midst of these sequences we see something important. We see that betrayal always comes with a cost, not just to the victim but to the betrayer as well, because even as Sanjaya tries to maneuver, to frame himself as a victim of circumstances, to justify what he did as just business, there are cracks starting to show in his expression, in his composure, especially when he hears that Sutanto is rising again, that the man he thought he had buried under bankruptcy and scandal is now part of a new, powerful partnership through Grup Laksana and Grup Symbolism. In a lesser film, maybe the story would push for a big, melodramatic confrontation between Sutanto and Sanjaya, maybe in a courtroom, maybe in some rainy street at night, but Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas takes a more restrained route, one that feels truer to its themes, because instead of giving us a shouted argument, it gives us a moment of quiet distance. Sutanto watching from afar as Sanjaya is escorted into a legal proceeding, their eyes not even meeting, and the real confrontation happens not in words but in the stark contrast between them, one man stepping into accountability, another man stepping into a new beginning. Emotionally, this is where the film becomes something more than just a revenge or comeback story, because Sutanto never truly seeks revenge in the traditional sense. He doesn't obsess about punishing his betrayers. He doesn't become consumed by getting even, and that choice is what keeps his character from being flattened into a cliché. Instead, he channels his pain into building, into helping others, into honoring the kindness that once shaped him and that he in turn extended to people like Demas, who are now paying it forward, which brings us to one of the most emotionally rich aspects of the film, the theme of gratitude as legacy, because Demas's actions throughout the story are not just about individual loyalty, they are a commentary on how one act of kindness can ripple through time, creating a chain of decency, a quiet network of people who remember, who feel moved not by obligation but by the knowledge that someone believed in them when it was inconvenient, when it didn't benefit them. And there's a scene where Demas confronts his own board members at Grup Laksana, who are skeptical about bringing in a man whose last company just crashed and burned, and he tells them something like, "You see a bankrupt businessman. I see the man who chose to help me when helping me looked like a bad investment," and in that moment, the film draws a sharp line between transactional relationships and real human connection. From a cinematic perspective, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas doesn't rely on flashy camera tricks or exaggerated drama. It's not trying to wow you with visual spectacle. Instead, it invests in mood, in framing, in silence, in those painful moments when a character has to sit alone with the consequences of their choices, and the music, subtle and melancholic, supports that approach, swelling not in the big corporate moments, not in the winning announcement or the courtroom scenes, but in the smaller, more painful ones. Sutanto counting money at his mother's bedside, trying to figure out how to pay hospital bills when his accounts have been frozen, workers approaching him with hesitant eyes asking, "Pak, gaji kami bagaimana?" and his voice breaking slightly as he tells them he's doing everything he can. The performances carry a lot of this weight, and while the film is anchored by Sutanto, whose portrayal of a man on the edge of financial ruin, on the edge of emotional collapse, on the edge of losing hope, is nuanced and lived in, the supporting cast also brings depth to the story, from the heartbreakingly fragile warmth of his mother, to the cold, almost stunned moral numbness of some of his adopted children, whose journey is not one of secret remorse but of doubling down on their choices, at least until the consequences finally corner them. And Sanjaya, as an antagonist, is not painted as a cartoon villain either. He's ambitious, yes, manipulative and morally flexible, but there are flickers of doubt, moments where you can see that he knows, deep down, that there is a line being crossed, and he chooses to cross it anyway, which in some ways makes him more chilling than if he had simply been ignorant. One of the most striking things about this movie, especially in the context of current Indonesian society and really any modern capitalist society, is how it weaves in the themes of corporate responsibility and moral accountability without ever feeling like it's preaching. It shows us the real human cost of business decisions, fathers who can't bring home groceries, mothers who delay medical checkups because their job is suddenly in limbo, young graduates whose first job is now a closed door, and it balances that social realism with the more intimate, almost spiritual journey of its protagonist, this man who seems cursed by his own goodness yet refuses to stop being good. Pacing-wise, the film takes its time in the first half. Some might even say it's slow if they come in expecting a fast-paced corporate thriller, but that deliberate rhythm is what allows the emotional stakes to build, because by the time the collapse happens, you're not just watching a company logo fall from a building, you're watching a man's life's work be taken away, you're watching promises dissolve, you're watching the faces of workers who believed in him, and the later act, with the chip competition and the legal fallout, feels almost like a second film, a rebirth story that picks up the shattered pieces from the first half and tries to fit them into a new, imperfect, but hopeful mosaic. In terms of cultural impact, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas carries a resonance that goes beyond its specific plot, especially for audiences who have seen or experienced the ripple effects of corporate bankruptcy, who know what it feels like when people in power make decisions from which they are protected while ordinary workers pay the price. And for many viewers, especially in Indonesia and perhaps across Southeast Asia, where the intersection of traditional familial values and modern business culture is constantly being renegotiated, the idea of adopted children betraying their benefactor, their foster father, hits hard, because it's not just financial betrayal, it's a violation of deeply held moral and cultural norms about filial piety, respect, and gratitude. And yet, the film doesn't simply wag its finger and say, "Look how bad these ungrateful children are." it uses their betrayal as a way to ask harder questions. What happens when success becomes more important than the values that built it? How easily can people rewrite the story of their past, convincing themselves that they owe nothing to those who once lifted them up? And what does it mean to remain kind in the face of such ingratitude? Does it make you naive, or does it reveal a strength that is rarer and more necessary than ever? Through all of this, one thing that stands out is how personal the film feels. Even amidst the corporate jargon and tech talk about chips and innovation, everything always circles back to the emotional reality of its characters. Demas, for instance, isn't just a good guy, introduced to offset the villains. He's a man wrestling with his own position of privilege and power, pressured by his board, by shareholders, by market expectations, and at several points he has to make tough choices too. How far is he willing to go to help Sutanto? How much is he willing to risk for the sake of gratitude and loyalty? And those questions become especially sharp in scenes where Laksana's stability is threatened by their association with a man marked by scandal. And yet, again and again, Demas chooses not to abandon Sutanto, not because it's the easier choice, but precisely because it isn't. And that's where the film reinforces one of its core messages. Real gratitude moves you into uncomfortable decisions, into sacrifice, not just into polite words and occasional gifts. The group dynamics within Sutanto's team at Grup Laksana also add texture to the narrative, as we see young engineers, designers, project managers, some of whom were once employees of Grup Perkasa, trying to reconcile their loyalty to their former boss with their fear of again being associated with failure. And these internal conflicts give rise to scenes of tension, arguments in meeting rooms, whispers in corridors, people asking, "Are we sure he won't drag us down again?" And Sutanto, hearing snippets of this, has to face the painful reality that his name, once associated with stability and generosity, is now tied to ruin in the public eye. But it's exactly this vulnerability that makes his perseverance so compelling, because he continues to show up, to contribute his ideas, his experience, his quiet wisdom, including in the crucial strategic meetings leading up to the chip competition, where he pushes for an approach that doesn't just aim for short-term flash but long-term reliability, an approach that symbolically mirrors his own values. Now, let's talk about the emotional core again. His mother, amidst everything that's happening, bankruptcy, legal investigations, new partnerships, chip competitions, the film never forgets that there is a frail woman in a bed somewhere, slowly fading away, embodying an older generation's values, watching her son struggle under a burden that seems far too heavy. And some of the most heartbreaking scenes are the ones where Sutanto, exhausted, comes to visit her, trying to smile, trying to reassure her that everything is fine, and she, with a kind of quiet, almost mystical clarity that often comes with age and illness, knows that he's lying, knows that he is drowning, and in one of their last conversations, before her condition worsens significantly, she tells him that kindness is never wasted, that even if it looks like the world is punishing him for being good, he must not let bitterness take root in his heart, because once that happens, the people who betrayed him will have won in a deeper, more permanent way. And when she eventually passes away, yes, the film does go there, it is not framed as a sensational moment. There is no dramatic hospital chaos, just a soft, quiet passing, with Sutanto holding her hand, tears slipping down his face, and the memory of her words, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas, pressing against his chest like a weight and a comfort all at once. And that grief becomes another layer in his drive to keep moving, to build something that she would be proud of, something that proves her philosophy right. And speaking of proving things right, the final stretch of the movie, where Laksana and Simmering seal their strategic collaboration after Sutanto's team wins the chip competition, is handled with a lot of emotional restraint, which might surprise viewers used to big triumphant musical cues and slow-motion victory shots. Here, the announcement is made in a fairly standard corporate event setting, lighting, applause, a handshake on stage, and yet, what really matters is not the external pomp but the internal release in Sutanto's expression, as he realizes that this partnership is more than just a business deal. It's a door opening, a statement that his story doesn't end with bankruptcy, that he is not forever defined by the betrayal he endured. But the film doesn't give you a neat, perfect happily ever after either, because even as things look brighter for Sutanto in this new chapter, there are still unresolved scars, relationships that cannot be mended, years of trust that cannot be rebuilt. And the narrative is honest about that. It doesn't force reconciliation where it would be unnatural. It doesn't have his adopted children suddenly repent and return to his side in a last-minute change of heart. Instead, It suggests that some fractures in life simply remain fractures, and the real victory is learning to live with that, to build new connections, to pour your love and mentorship into people who do value it. At the same time, the legal consequences for Sanjaya and the other conspirators come to a head, culminating in formal charges, court proceedings, public exposure of their actions, and while the film gives us some satisfaction in seeing them face justice, it avoids turning that satisfaction into gloating, instead framing it as an almost inevitable balancing of scales, a reminder that while justice may be slow, while it may not always come in the way or timeline we want, the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when there are people brave enough to speak up, to present evidence, to resist the intimidation of those in power. One of the subtler things Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas does is to show that Sutanto is not passively waiting for karma to handle everything either. He cooperates with investigations, he provides what information he can, but he does all of this without malice, almost with a kind of sad acceptance, as if saying, this must be done, not for my revenge, but for the sake of everyone who suffered because of their actions. And that distinction is crucial to understanding his character. He is not a saint, he feels anger, he feels hurt, but he refuses to let those feelings be the engine of his decisions. Looking at the film from a thematic lens, one of the most powerful threads is the question of what truly holds value in a world obsessed with material success, and by the time the credits roll, that initial line from his mother about the golden value of kindness comes full circle, because we've seen in very concrete ways how Sutanto's acts of generosity shape the world around him. Demas's success, the loyalty of certain former employees, even the small kindnesses people extend back to him when he is at rock bottom. In many ways, the film argues that while money can vanish overnight, through betrayal, through bad luck, through systemic injustice, the impact of a good heart, of fair treatment, of genuine mentorship, continues long after the bank accounts are emptied, and from an audience reaction perspective, it's not hard to imagine viewers seeing their own struggles, their own disappointments, reflected in this story. Whether it's losing a job due to decisions made far above their pay grade, or feeling betrayed by people they trusted, or simply trying to hold on to their values in systems that reward the opposite, the movie invites its viewers to cry, yes, to feel anger, yes, but more than that, it invites them to think quietly afterward about what kind of person they want to be in their own spheres of influence, however big or small. When we talk about performances, we have to highlight the actor playing Sutanto again, because he carries the entire emotional architecture of the film almost on his shoulders, not with grand speeches, but with weary sighs, trembling hands, the kind of eyes that look both tired and stubbornly alive, the kind of presence that makes you believe this man could be your father, your uncle, your boss, the neighbor you wave to every morning. And that universality is what makes his journey hit so hard. Demas too is portrayed with great subtlety, managing to blend strength with vulnerability, confident leadership with the humility of someone who never forgot where he came from, and the scenes between him and Sutanto are some of the most quietly powerful in the film, often just two men sitting over a table, talking about risk, about failure, about responsibility, and those conversations feel almost like the backbone of the film's philosophical undercurrent. Visually, the director uses light and shadow with intention, bathing scenes of betrayal and collapse in colder, harsher light, while giving moments of connection and redemption a softer, warmer glow, and though that may sound obvious, it's executed with a delicacy that feels organic rather than heavy-handed, supported by a sound design that leans into silence, letting the absence of music speak louder than any dramatic score ever could in scenes of deep emotional truth. And somewhere in the middle of all this, there is the storyline of the unpaid wages, which the film refuses to brush aside as a mere subplot, instead returning again and again to the faces of Sutanto's former employees, the tension in their voices, the desperation mounting as days turn into weeks, and this thread amplifies the stakes of the legal process and the significance of the new partnership, because for Sutanto, the deal with Grup Simmering is not just about personal redemption, it's about generating the capacity to make things right, to ensure that those people receive what is owed to them, to clean up the mess left behind, even though he was not the one who created it, and that determination to take responsibility, even when you've been victimized, becomes one of the most quietly heroic aspects of his character, embodying a kind of leadership that is rare both in real life and in film. By the time there are movies that entertain you, and then there are movies that reach into your chest, squeeze your heart with both hands, and leave you sitting in silence long after the credits roll, questioning how you live your life, and Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is absolutely one of those films, the kind of slow-burning Indonesian drama that sneaks up on you with quiet moments of kindness and then smashes everything to pieces with betrayal, only to rebuild something even more precious from the ruins. Like gold that's been purified by fire, and watching it feels less like consuming a story and more like remembering something you forgot about what it means to be human. Before we dive into all of that though, before I unpack why this film about a tired old businessman, an ungrateful family, a grateful stranger, and a nation racing to catch up in a world of chip technology hit me so hard, let me just say this clearly, before we continue. Please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I really want to know from which city, which country, which little corner of the world you're sharing this emotional journey with me as we talk about this movie that honestly feels like a love letter to kindness in a pretty cruel era. And alright, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas, released in 2025, arriving in Indonesian cinemas and on streaming platforms at a time when people are already exhausted with cynical news and endless scandals, and here comes this film that dares to say, hey, maybe being kind is still worth something, maybe a good heart still matters, even when it seems to cost you everything. The movie is centered on Pak Sutanto, a man whose entire identity has been built around being generous, being the person who always pays a little extra, who takes in children who aren't his blood, who lends money he doesn't have to spare, and who built Grup Perkasa from almost nothing into a solid mid-size Indonesian conglomerate over decades, and right from the opening scenes, the film puts us into his world with an intimacy that's almost uncomfortable, because we don't meet him as a powerful CEO, we meet him as a son, standing in a dimly lit hospital corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing, clutching a crumpled receipt in his hand after paying another medical bill for his aging, gravely ill mother, the camera lingering on the veins on his hand, the slight tremor in his fingers, the way he forces a small smile when the nurse says, "Terima kasih, Pak," and that's when you realize this story isn't just about money and companies and contracts, it's about that quiet weight of responsibility that so many people in this part of the world know too well, that feeling of being the pillar of the family, the expectation that you will hold everything up, even as your knees start to buckle. The film quickly sketches the scope of his life, at home, his elderly mother, frail but sharp-eyed, still concerned more about whether he's eaten than about her own condition. Circling around him are his adopted children, whom he took in years ago out of sheer compassion, kids he raised, educated, and groomed to take over Grup Perkasa one day, kids who, at least at first glance, look like the success stories of his kindness. Here they are in tailored suits, driving nice cars, sipping artisan coffee, sliding into meetings with all the casual entitlement of a new generation that never really knew what it cost to build the world they inherited. And then in the office, rows of loyal workers who greet him not with fear but with warmth, with "Pajai, Pak," and grateful nods, people who have been with him since the early days, when they worked in hot warehouses and cramped offices and believed in this one man's vision. Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas takes its time in this early act, letting us live with these characters, see how the dynamics work, and I love that. Because it means that when everything collapses, it's not abstract, it hurts, it feels personal. Now, on the surface, if you just read the synopsis, you might think this is some dry corporate drama about a company going bankrupt and some competition about chip technology, but the genius of the film is that it uses those structural elements as a backdrop, almost like a pressure cooker, to examine something much more intimate. What happens when kindness collides with ambition, when loyalty is tested by opportunity, and when gratitude stretches across years to come back at the exact moment it's needed? So let me give you a quick, spoiler-light overview before we later go fully into the heavy details. We follow Pak Sutanto as he's betrayed by the very children he raised, and by a trusted collaborator named Sanjaya, the kind of slick, ambitious man who smells like expensive cologne and quiet danger. A man who sees in Grup Perkasa not a shared legacy but an asset to be stripped, and their betrayal doesn't just hurt emotionally, it destroys the company, pushing Grup Perkasa to bankruptcy. Reach the end of Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas, what stays with you is not any single twist or big dramatic moment, but the cumulative weight of everything Sutanto endures and the way he chooses to respond to it, not with bitterness, not with cruelty, not by becoming like the people who wronged him, but by doubling down on the very values that made him vulnerable in the first place, proving that vulnerability is not weakness when it is paired with courage and perseverance. In its final scenes, the film offers us glimpses of a quieter future, Sutanto working in a more modest but warm office within Grup Laksana, his photo from the early days of Grup Perkasa on the wall, not as a shrine to lost glory but as a reminder of where he came from. Dimas stopping by with a cup of coffee, making a small joke, hinting at new projects they will tackle together. A former worker of Grup Perkasa coming up to him, smiling, telling him he finally received his back pay and that his family is safe now. And as Sutanto steps outside, the city around him alive with its endless churn of ambition and struggle, he pauses for a moment, looking up at the sky, as if silently thanking his mother, as if promising that he'll keep walking the path she set him on. The film doesn't promise that everything will be perfect from here on out. It doesn't pretend that kindness will always be rewarded or that justice will always be neatly served, but it insists, stubbornly, tenderly, that kindness still matters. That gratitude can still change lives, that in a world that often feels cold and transactional, there is still immense, immeasurable value in a good heart, a heart of gold. And as the credits roll, you're left not with the urge to cheer loudly, but with the urge to sit quietly for a moment and think about the people in your own life who have shown you kindness, who have believed in you when there was no logical reason to, and maybe, just maybe, you feel the stirrings of a desire to become that person for someone else. Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is far from a perfect film. Yes, some scenes might feel a bit stretched, some dialogues a little on the nose, and viewers hoping for a more fast-paced, twist-heavy corporate thriller might find its realistic pacing a bit slow. But as a human story, as a meditation on loyalty, gratitude, and resilience, it hits more often than it misses, and its imperfections almost add to its sense of authenticity, like the cracks in Sutanto's life story that make his eventual partial healing feel earned rather than manufactured. So if you come to this film ready not just to be entertained, but to feel, to reflect, to walk for a while in the shoes of a man who loses everything and still finds a way to hold on to his goodness, you might find that it has more to offer than you expected. And if you've ever wondered whether kindness is worth it in a world that seems built to reward the opposite, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas stands before you like a quiet answer, not shouted, not imposed, but whispered through the arc of a life, through the ripples of one man's choices, through the gratitude of those who remember his goodness when the world has turned its back on him. In the end, this is not just a story about betrayal and justice, it's a story about what survives when everything else is taken away, about the way acts of compassion can echo across years, circling back when you least expect it, sometimes in the form of a man named Dimas offering you a new beginning when all doors seem closed, sometimes in the form of a distant worker's smile as they tell you that your efforts made a difference. And as I sit here, replaying the scenes in my mind, the empty office of Grup Perkasa, the hospital room bathed in soft morning light, the tension of the chip competition, the quiet strength of a man who refuses to let the darkness of others extinguish his own light, I can't help but ask you, if you made it this far with me in this journey through Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas, through its heartbreak and its hope, through its portrayal of kindness as something truly priceless. Since you said yes, let's go even deeper into Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas, because the more you sit with this film, the more little details, little emotional echoes, start to reveal themselves, and it stops feeling like just a story about one man and one company and starts feeling like this mirror held up to so many things happening around us right now, especially in places like Indonesia where tradition and modernity are constantly tugging at each other, and where questions about money, loyalty, and family are never just personal, they are communal, they are spiritual, they are heavy. And maybe that's why I keep coming back in my head to the way the movie shows us those early dinner scenes with Pak Sutanto and his adopted children, because on the first watch, it's easy to read them in a very simple way, generous father, ungrateful kids, but if you really pay attention, there's so much layered into the body language, the table talk, even what's being served on the plates. Notice how in the first big family dinner we see, his mother is still present at the table, sitting a little apart but very much a part of the conversation, occasionally chiming in with old stories. The food is home-cooked, served in shared dishes, everyone reaching in, the kind of communal eating that's both practical and symbolic in Southeast Asian families. And when the subject of the company comes up, it's not framed primarily as our asset, it's framed as our responsibility, with Sutanto reminding them how many families depend on Perkasa's stability. You can see how he hopes his children will internalize that, but the camera catches these quick, telling reactions, Myra glancing down at her phone under the table, Raka pushing food around his plate, Yudi eager to change the topic to expansion, to international opportunities, to scaling up, and what's brilliant is how the film doesn't immediately condemn those desires, because wanting to grow, to modernize, to compete globally There's nothing inherently wrong with that. This is where the movie refuses to be a simple nostalgia piece about the good old days and those terrible modern kids. Instead it asks, what do we lose and what do we gain when we update our values for a new economy? You feel that tension most strongly in Raka, who, in a lesser script, would just be the arrogant eldest son drunk on position, but here he's painfully aware that he's adopted, painfully aware that the name on the building is not originally his, and his hunger to prove himself doesn't come from pure greed. It comes partly from insecurity, from nights lying awake thinking, if I don't make this company bigger, what if they all realize I didn't deserve to inherit it in the first place? There's a moment before the coup where he's standing alone in the darkened boardroom, staring at the huge Percasa logo on the wall, and we hear just a faint whisper of his thoughts, maybe a line he murmurs to himself like, Kalau Gu Ngat Barani, Gu Bukan Siapa, if I don't dare, I'm nobody. And that line reframes everything that follows. It doesn't excuse it, but it tells us that his betrayal is driven by fear as much as by ambition. Meanwhile, Myra, with her sharp tongue and Instagram-perfect lifestyle, could have easily become the caricature of the spoiled daughter, but the movie slips in these little glimpses of vulnerability, her staring a bit too long at families with biological resemblance, her defensiveness. Whenever someone jokes about plastic surgery or artificial looks, there's even a scene where she visits a children's home one of their foundation supports, and she interacts so awkwardly with the kids that it's almost painful to watch, not because she doesn't care, but because being in that space makes her confront her own origins as an abandoned child taken in by someone else, and the film doesn't spell that out in dialogue. It lets you feel it in the way she pulls back from a little girl who tries to hold her hand. All of that is to say, when the knife finally goes in, when these children sign papers that will effectively strip their father of control and drive the company toward ruin, the hurt is deeper because we've seen that they are not evil, they are just lost, and that makes them frighteningly relatable, and if we're honest, some of us watching probably saw pieces of ourselves in them, in the way we rationalize morally grey decisions with, it's for the future, or everyone is doing it, in the way we tell ourselves that the older generation just doesn't get it, that sometimes you have to be ruthless to survive. This is where the film starts to feel almost like a parable about capitalism in developing countries, about how the language of efficiency and modernization can be used to justify almost anything, especially when you throw in the fear of being left behind by the rest of the world. Sanjaya embodies that sleek rhetoric perfectly, always packaging his schemes as visionary leaps forward. Every time he appears, pay attention to the way he uses English business jargon mixed with polite Indonesian, almost like a spell. Phrases like strategic optimization and leverage our human capital, and if you've ever sat in a corporate meeting, you know exactly that kind of talk. He tells the kids that their father's insistence on paying full benefits, on keeping unprofitable departments, is unsustainable, and that word hits hard because it's one of those terms we toss around uncritically in business contexts, forgetting that sustainability should be about human well-being as much as about financial margins. What makes Sanjaya dangerous isn't just his greed, it's his ability to cloak it in what sounds like rational, responsible management, and honestly, that's scarier than a mustache-twirling villain, because that's what real-world corruption often looks like, men in suits twisting spreadsheets until they can convince themselves they are not really hurting anyone. The movie uses visual language cleverly here too. When Sanjaya meets with the adopted children in private, the scene is often framed with glass between them and the rest of the office floor, reflections of city lights overlaying their faces, making them look like they are already half separated from the people they are supposed to serve. It's subtle, but it sticks with you. And speaking of imagery, can we talk about the recurring symbolism of gold and light in this movie? Because the title is not just poetic, it's worked into the visual DNA of the film. Early on, when things are still relatively stable, there's a warm gold hue to many scenes, late afternoon sun spilling through the windows of the old Percasa office, the soft glint of a simple gold ring on Sutanto's mother's finger, the way the camera lingers for a second on the golden lettering of the Percasa logo as workers clock out for the day. That warmth isn't there by accident. It visually ties back to the idea that goodness, generosity, and honor have their own kind of luster, even if they don't always translate into stock prices. Later, after the betrayal, notice how that specific tone of gold almost disappears, replaced by colder whites and blues, sterile hospital lighting, the metallic sheen of legal offices and high-tech labs. The only time that warm glow creeps back in is around acts of genuine kindness or reconciliation. The warung scene with Horun, Demas showing up at the cheap rented room with his offer, the quiet funeral where old employees come to pay respects to Sutanto's mother. In those moments, the cinematography seems to say, here, this is what truly shines, this is the gold that the title is talking about. And then you have the metaphor of fire, present both literally and figuratively, the welding sparks in the old factory, the small stove at the warung where meals are cooked, the candle in the hospital room. When the power flickers for a moment, and of course the mother's line about gold being formed in fire, all of these elements build this unconscious link between suffering and refinement, between hardship and the strengthening of character. It's not telling you that suffering is good in itself, that's a dangerous idea, but it is suggesting that how you respond to suffering can reveal, or even reshape, who you are. And that's exactly what we see with Sutanto. After losing everything, he could have easily turned into a bitter old man, railing against his children, demanding his rights, blaming everyone else, and the plot would have justified that. Instead, we watch him choose again and again to take responsibility, to say, I should have seen this coming, to say, I trusted the wrong people. And I know some viewers were frustrated by that, feeling like he was letting the real culprits off the hook. But I think the film is very intentional there. He doesn't shield his children and Sanjaya from legal consequences. He fully cooperates with the investigation when it finally comes to him, but emotionally, he refuses to let hatred define his final years. That refusal is where his power lies. There's a small, easily missed scene late in the film, after the legal verdicts have come down, where Sutanto runs into Raka by chance at a government office, Raka there for some mandatory appearance related to his case, Sutanto there on some unrelated corporate errand for Grup Laksana. They lock eyes, there's this long, heavy silence, and you can feel the temptation in the air. Raka wants to justify himself, to say it was Sanjaya's idea, to say he didn't know it would go that far. Sutanto, on his side, surely wants to ask why, to demand some acknowledgement of the pain he's caused, but what actually happens is so much more powerful than any shouted confrontation. Raka, eyes brimming with tears, manages only a choked, maaf, pak, and Sutanto, after a tiny pause that feels like an eternity, nods and replies softly, Jaga dirimu, take care of yourself. That's it, that's the whole exchange. They walk away in opposite directions, and in those few words, what we get is not some complete, neatly wrapped forgiveness arc, but a first crack in the wall, a small admission of guilt, a small extension of grace. It feels incredibly true to life, especially in cultures where direct, emotional confrontations are rare and so much is communicated in what's unsaid. And then there's Yudi, the youngest, whose guilt manifests differently. He starts volunteering quietly at a legal aid organization that supports workers harmed by corporate fraud, anonymously at first, just helping with intake, carrying boxes, trying, in his fumbling way, to atone. When Sutanto learns about this through a mutual acquaintance, he doesn't rush to see him for a big reconciliation scene. Instead, we just get a shot of him hearing the news, closing his eyes, and this small, weary smile appearing on his face. He doesn't say it, but you can tell he's thinking, at least something good came out of all this, and that ambiguity, not fully absolving, not fully condemning, is one of the reasons this movie feels so emotionally honest. And we can't talk about honesty without bringing up Rani, the financial crimes investigator, because she's almost like the moral backbone of the institutional world in this film. In a story filled with people compromising and rationalizing, she's one of the few who just quietly does her job, following the money, insisting on proper procedure. She's not dramatized as some crusading, spotlight-seeking hero. She's a civil servant who believes that the rule of law matters, even if it's slow and unglamorous. I love that scene where one of her colleagues suggests dropping part of the case to save time, now that Sanjaya is already clearly going to be convicted, and she pushes back, saying, Kalau yang kesel kita anggap nggak penting, lama-lama yang besar juga hilang. If we treat the small things as unimportant, eventually the big things will disappear too. That line echoes thematically with the movie's whole stance on kindness. Small acts matter, small violations matter, because over time they build a culture, either of care or of corruption. In a way, Rani is in the same business as Sutanto, just in a different arena. Both of them believe that doing the right thing consistently, even when no one is watching, is what holds society together. And I like that the film never directly connects them with some contrived meeting. They never share a scene, their arcs run parallel, and we, the audience, are the ones meant to see the resonance. Switching gears a bit, let's talk about the tech side of this story, the whole chip competition angle, because on paper, putting Semiconductor strategy into the same movie as intergenerational betrayal and filial piety sounds like a recipe for tonal chaos, but somehow Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas pulls it off, largely because it uses that plot not to show off cool gadgets, but to explore that anxiety so many developing nations feel. Are we destined to always be consumers of other people's tech, or can we become creators? The film is quite clever in how it depicts the different approaches of the competing teams. One group proposes essentially assembling foreign-designed chips domestically, slapping a "Made in Indonesia" label on them while the real value add stays overseas. Another team pitches a very aggressive, cost-cutting plan that relies heavily on underpaid contract workers and lacks safety standards. It's clearly the path of least resistance, the quickest way to profit, and it's framed as pragmatic, realistic, all those words that can be used to cover up exploitation. In contrast, the proposal from Grup, Laksana and Sutanto's division is more modest on paper, more incremental, but carefully thought out, building local expertise step by step, investing heavily in training, planning for a long-term move up the value chain rather than quick wins. There's a great, tense conversation between Dimas and a potential investor where this vision is tested. The investor wants faster returns, suggests outsourcing part of the work to a cheaper, less regulated facility abroad, and when Dimas hesitates, is accused of being naive, of letting sentiment get in the way of business. The way that scene is shot, close-ups on hands, tapping fingers, the investor's expensive watch, Dimas's tightening jaw, drives home that this isn't just about one contract, it's about what kind of economic future the country is going to commit to. And when Dimas finally replies, "Kalau kita bangun masa depan di atas ketidakadilan, kita cuma nunda masalah, bukan menyelesaikan," if we build the future on injustice, we're only postponing problems, not solving them. You can feel how this young man has internalized the lessons he unconsciously absorbed from Sutanto's example. It's that beautiful full-circle storytelling. Years ago, a businessman's kindness expanded a boy's possibilities, and now that boy, grown up, is shaping a business that reflects that kindness on a structural level. In this way, the movie suggests that ethical behavior doesn't just live in individuals, it can be encoded into systems, into the very design of industries, if the right people fight for it. On the technical side, I appreciate that the script doesn't overwhelm you with jargon. It drops in just enough real terminology, lithography, wafer yields, fabrication nodes, to make you believe these people know what they're talking about, but it never loses sight of the human stakes. Scenes in clean rooms are intercut with scenes of workers' families, of local communities that will either benefit from good jobs or suffer from environmental shortcuts, depending on the choices made. That kind of cross-cutting is one of the movie's signature techniques. You'll see a boardroom discussion about margins and timelines, and then it'll cut to Horun's daughter studying late at night, textbooks spread out, the lamp flickering because they haven't been able to pay the electricity bill. That visual editing constantly reminds you that behind every business decision are real lives, and that makes the eventual success in the competition feel less like, "Yay, our side won," and more like, "Okay, maybe hundreds of families now have a more stable future." And by the way, Horun's arc, though small, is one of my favorites. He starts the movie as this almost archetypal loyal employee, the guy who's been there since day one, who always defends the boss in the cafeteria debates, who believes that things will work out because "Pak Tantong Gak akan tinggalin kita," he won't leave us. When the bankruptcy hits, he's the one trying to keep morale up, telling others to be patient, even as his own finances crumble. There's a heartbreaking scene where his daughter gently confronts him, saying that maybe it's time to stop defending the company and think about their family first, and he doesn't have a good answer. Later, when he gets that last partial payment from Sutanto, you can see in his eyes that the money matters, of course. But what matters even more is that his faith wasn't entirely misplaced, that the man he believed in really did try until the very end. Flash forward to the epilogue, when we see Horun as a supervisor in the new chip plant, training younger workers, and you see how loyalty isn't just a one-way street, it's something that, when honored, can ripple outward, creating a culture where people actually trust their leaders, not because of propaganda, but because of lived experience. All of this contributes to why the movie hits such a nerve with audiences. It doesn't just scold or preach. It invites you to identify with almost every major player at some point, to see how easy it is to slide from compromise into complicity, how hard it is to stay good when you're tired and scared, and that's why, for many viewers, the scenes with Sutanto's mother are the emotional anchor. In a world of shifting loyalties and slippery ethics, she is unwavering, not perfect. The film hints at her own regrets, Maybe about not questioning some of her son's early decisions more, but clear-eyed about what really matters. She keeps asking him about people, not about profit. When he updates her on the company, she asks, Karya one mu gimana, how are your employees, not, how are your numbers? And in one particularly piercing moment, after hearing about the betrayal, she asks him, Kamu marah sama mereka, you angry at them? And when he hesitates, she follows up with, Kalau marah, jangan lama-lama. Berat nanti bawanya sampai akhir hidup, if you're angry, don't stay that way for too long, it'll be heavy to carry that until the end of your life. That line broke me, because it's not a demand for instant forgiveness. She acknowledges the reality of anger, but a gentle reminder that clinging to it will only poison him. The movie doesn't use her as some magical wise elder who fixes everything, but her words become this quiet compass that he keeps returning to. After her death, we see him visit her grave before making big decisions, not because he thinks she'll literally answer, but because he's trying to check his choices against the values she embodied. It's such a grounded, culturally resonant depiction of how parents can continue to influence their children long after they are gone. Now, in terms of acting, her performance is subtle but potent, the kind of role that doesn't get flashy awards buzz but that audiences remember years later. The tremor in her hand when she tries to spoon soup, the way she squeezes her son's fingers when he thinks she's asleep, these little gestures are what make their relationship so believable. And that believability is crucial, because the entire movie hinges on us accepting that this is a man who grew up under a certain moral regime, one that insists you never abandon family, you always repay debt, you always use whatever power you have to lift others if you can. Juxtapose that with Sanjaya, whose background we only glimpse in hints, an offhand comment about coming from a tough neighborhood, a disdainful remark about Orang Kessel that slips out when he's stressed, and you start to see how two men from not so different origins chose very different paths. One hardened himself, one kept himself soft, and the movie makes a quiet, radical argument that softness, which is often despised in business culture, is actually its own kind of courage. One of the reasons this film resonated beyond just the usual drama-loving crowd is that it lands right in the middle of current anxieties about what kind of people we are producing in our corporate and startup ecosystems. There's this growing awareness that hustle culture, when taken to extremes, can breed a generation that knows how to pitch, how to scale, how to disrupt, but not necessarily how to care. Social media discussions around the movie often centered on lines like, Apakah baik itu masih relevan di zaman sekarang? Is being good still relevant nowadays? That's a question we hear everywhere now, not just in Indonesia. The film doesn't answer with a simple yes or no. Instead, it shows you the cost of saying no, the hollow victories, the legal consequences, the burned bridges, and the cost of saying yes, the heartbreak, the vulnerability, the slower path, and then it quietly invites you to choose which cost you'd rather pay. For me, the shot that sums this up is not the big courtroom scenes or the contract signing. It's a small moment quite late in the film, after checking in on the first phase of the chip project, after meeting with engineers and talking numbers. Sutanto is walking through the factory floor and stops to help a young worker pick up some dropped tools. They share a brief, awkward laugh, and in that instant, the camera frames him not as a hero or a martyr or a legend, but just as a man among other working people, a humanizing of someone who once towered above others in a corporate tower. The hierarchy has flattened, he has been humbled, but the essence of who he is, the man who stops to help, who notices people, remains intact. That's the gold the title promises, the part that doesn't get burned away. And as we pull back from all of this, from the story of one man, one company, one competition, I think what makes Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas special is that it doesn't pretend kindness will fix systemic problems by itself. It shows us legal institutions, investigative journalism, regulatory frameworks, all playing their parts in bringing down the villains and opening space for better practices. But it insists that without people like Sutanto and Dimas, people whose first instinct is to give instead of take, those systems will be hollow. Laws without good hearts behind them can be bent, technologies without ethics behind them can be weaponized. That's the final note the film leaves lingering in the air as the credits roll, this sense that in a world of chips and contracts and courtrooms, the most valuable currency is still something intangible, something that can't be printed or mined, only lived. And if you're anything like me, you'll finish the movie feeling a little raw, a little more aware of the ways you've been helped by others, maybe even thinking of one or two people you should call or text to say thank you, because their Kebaikan Hati has, in some way, been the gold in your own life. And if a film can move you not just to feel, but to act differently, even in small ways, then that's worth revisiting, worth unpacking, worth talking about at length like we've just done here. The question now is whether stories like this will keep being told in our increasingly cynical media landscape, whether audiences will keep showing up not just for spectacle but for sincerity, and that, in a way, is up to us, the viewers, the ones who choose what to watch, what to share, what to support. So as you sit there, wherever you are, replaying scenes of Pak Sutanto in that dim hospital corridor, of Demas at the door with slightly trembling hands, of a crowd of workers outside a shuttered gate, and that final image of a modest grave watched over by a son who finally understands what his mother was trying to teach him all along, I'll leave you once again with that simple invitation wrapped as a question that this very film itself seemed to ask you through my voice. To choose greed or gratitude, pride or humility, revenge or integrity, fear or love, and if Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas leaves you with anything, let it be this, that even in the harshest storms of betrayal and loss, there is a kind of strength in choosing to remain kind, a kind of wealth in choosing to remember those who helped you up, and a kind of victory in continuing to build, to give, and to love, even when the world tells you it's foolish. And so, standing at the end of this long, winding reflection on a film that wears its heart not on its sleeve but deep in its bones, I turn the question back to you, not just about this movie, but about this whole way of looking at stories, at life, at the quiet power of goodness. There's a particular kind of yes that comes from your gut, the kind that doesn't just mean, I liked that movie, but I saw a piece of myself in that story. And if your yes to hearing more about Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas comes from that place, then let's dive even deeper into the corners of this film that linger beneath the surface, because the beauty of a movie like this isn't just in what it shows, but in what it quietly suggests between the lines, in the questions it leaves echoing long after the last frame fades to black, and returning to this story feels almost like revisiting a place you know, walking the same streets but noticing new details on the walls, new cracks in the pavement, new bits of color you missed the first time around. When we talked about Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas earlier, we explored the broad strokes, the rise and fall of Grup Perkasa, the cruel betrayal of Pak Sutanto by his own adopted children and by Sanjaya, the heavy combination of professional collapse and his mother's worsening illness, the moral responsibility he feels towards his employees, Demas stepping in as a living embodiment of gratitude, the partnership with Grup Laksana, and the eventual victory in the chip technology competition organized by Grup Simmering that opens the door to a new future. We touched on the legal reckoning that comes for Sanjaya and his accomplices, and how the film chooses dignity and moral resilience over simple revenge, but there's more living between those plot beats. There are small character choices, symbolic details, and emotional arcs that deserve a closer look, because they are what make this film feel like more than just a straightforward drama. They are what make it feel like a lived experience. One of the first subtle things that really stands out when you sit with this film is how it treats the idea of family, and not in the conventional, sentimental sense, but as something deeply complicated, especially when it intersects with power and money. From the outside, the story of Pak Sutanto and his adopted children could be framed as inspiring. A man takes in children, gives them a home, raises them, educates them, brings them into his company, gives them not just shelter but a future. That in itself is enough for a feel-good backstory in most films, but Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas refuses to romanticize it. Instead, it asks, what happens when those children grow up not just with love and opportunity, but with proximity to wealth, control, and entitlement? Over the course of the film, through flashbacks and small conversations, we slowly understand that while Sutanto poured his heart into raising them, there were fractures forming beneath the surface long before the betrayal we see on screen. In an early flashback, for instance, we might see a younger Sutanto celebrating a milestone, a new factory opening, a big contract, with his children all around him at a long dinner table, everyone laughing. But then there's a tiny moment when one of them makes a snarky remark about how, this will all be ours someday, and even though it's played off as a joke, the camera lingers just a second too long on Sutanto's face, hinting at a discomfort, a concern he chooses not to voice, maybe out of love, maybe out of denial. Later, another flashback might show a disagreement about a business decision. Sutanto wants to invest in employee housing or health benefits, something that reflects his values, while his adopted son or daughter pushes for a riskier, profit-driven move that would impress investors, and the disagreement ends with them backing down, on the surface out of respect, but underneath, resentment begins to grow, the sense that their father's old-fashioned priorities are holding them back. these glimpses help paint the betrayal not as something that came out of nowhere, but as something that was quietly building for years, which makes it all the more tragic, because it suggests that this wasn't just a sudden fall from grace, it was a long, slow erosion of shared values, and that erosion ties into something almost sociological the film is saying about generational change. The older generation, represented by Sutanto and his mother, clings to principles like loyalty, gratitude, and the moral obligation of those who have to protect those who don't, while the younger generation, including his adopted children and Sanjaya, are seduced by a more individualistic worldview, where success is measured in numbers on screens, market share, status, where gratitude is seen as something sentimental, almost irrelevant in the hard math of business, and yet, the film doesn't swing into black and white moralizing, because even among the younger characters, there are shades of difference. Not every adopted child is equally ruthless, some clearly struggle, some show flickers of hesitation, guilt, confusion, but go along with the plan anyway, which is almost more painful to watch than villainy, because it reflects how real life complicity often works. Not everyone involved in a harmful decision is a mastermind, many are simply too afraid or too self-interested to resist when the tide moves in a certain direction. This brings us to Sanjaya, whose character becomes even more intriguing the more you think about him. At a surface level, he's the architect of the coup against Sutanto, the ambitious manager or executive who sees an opportunity to grab control by exploiting the insecurities, greed, or frustrations of Sutanto's children, and the film shows him in sleek settings, closed-door meetings, late-night strategy sessions, speaking with the calm confidence of someone used to having others listen to him. But pay attention to the small details, and you start to see something else, a kind of hollowness under the charisma, a constant need to prove himself, to be seen as the visionary, the one who fixed the inefficiencies of the older generation. There's a scene, for instance, where he's alone, late at night in his office, after one of the key steps in their plan has succeeded, and instead of celebrating, instead of relaxing, he just sits there, staring out at the city, his reflection superimposed on the glass, and his face is not that of a man at peace, but of someone who isn't sure what victory will even feel like, someone who may be chasing power not because of what it will give him, but because of what he fears he is without it. That empty look hints at the possibility that, at some earlier point in his life, Sanjaya himself may have felt overlooked, underestimated, perhaps coming from more modest means than the final power he wields, and instead of responding to that experience with gratitude when he did find success, he responded with hunger, with a refusal to ever feel powerless again, and that hunger turned him into the very thing he once resented. The film doesn't spell all this out in exposition, but careful viewers can feel it between lines of dialogue and in the way he reacts when things don't go as planned. And this undercurrent is what makes his eventual downfall feel not only just but also tragically inevitable, because a life built on the fear of being powerless will often drive you to make choices that destroy everything you gained in the first place. In sharp contrast to all that noise and grasping, you have the quiet core of Sutanto, and the more you think about his journey, the more powerful his restraint becomes. In many revenge-driven narratives, when a character is betrayed, the focus shifts to them plotting their retaliation, pulling strings behind the scenes to take their enemies down, and while Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas doesn't shy away from the reality that legal accountability is necessary, it makes a deliberate choice not to turn Sutanto into a mastermind of payback. Instead, it gives us a man who, when everything is taken from him, goes through something more relatable and more human: denial, devastation, shame. There's a recurring motif in the film where Sutanto avoids looking at mirrors after the bankruptcy, as if he can't quite face the version of himself he now is, the man who failed in front of his workers and his mother, even though logically he knows he was the one betrayed. At one point, he's washing his face in a small, dim bathroom, far from the sleek private restrooms of his old office, and he looks up just for a second at the cracked mirror and immediately looks away, the shot lingering on the half-seen reflection, suggesting that part of his journey isn't just about rebuilding his reputation in the eyes of others, but about slowly finding his own self-respect again. And that's where Demas's presence becomes so important, not just as a plot device, but as a mirror that reflects back to Sutanto who he really is beneath the public scandal. When Demas reaches out to him, offers him a place in Grup Laksana, it's not just an act of charity, it's an act of recognition. I know what kind of man you are, because I am the proof of your kindness. And in a way, Demas is what happens when gratitude takes root and grows healthy, where Sanjaya is what happens when insecurity festers and becomes greed. the conversations between Dimas and Sutanto are some of the most thematically rich in the movie, because they are not just about business strategy, they are about how to live with loss, how to act when your name has been dragged through the mud, and whether it's worth trying to be good in a world that seems to punish goodness. In one scene, for instance, after yet another setback in their preparation for the chip competition, Sutanto suggests that maybe they should step back, that maybe he's become a liability to Laksana, and Dimas responds with something like, "Pak, if I only kept people around me when they were at their peak, I wouldn't be here, because you didn't meet me at my peak. You met me at my lowest, when I was no one," and that line encapsulates the entire moral logic of their relationship. Kindness, given in times of weakness, creates bonds far stronger than alliances formed only in moments of strength. Moving deeper into the chip competition arc, it's interesting to see how the film takes what might have been a purely technical storyline, development cycles, prototype testing, performance metrics, and uses it as a metaphor for resilience and identity. The chip they're designing isn't just a product, it's a statement of intent, and the way the team works on it reflects the emotional state of the group. At first, after Sutanto joins, there is tension, doubt, even resistance, especially from younger engineers who only know him through headlines and gossip, seeing him as the man whose company crashed and burned, not as the mentor who saved countless careers in the past. Their skepticism is understandable, and the film doesn't vilify them for it. Instead, it allows us to see them as products of the information age. They judge what they don't know based on surface narratives, on viral, business failure stories, and it takes time, little interactions, and moments of shared struggle for them to begin to see the man behind the headlines. And this gradual shift is mirrored in the progress of the chip project itself. Early prototypes fail, glitches appear, timelines slip, investors get nervous, and each failure is like a test of the team's faith, not just in the technology, but in the leadership guiding them. Sutanto, though deeply experienced, isn't portrayed as some perfect, flawless guru who always has the right answer. He makes miscalculations, he underestimates certain technical constraints, but what distinguishes him isn't perfection, it's accountability. When something fails, he doesn't throw his team under the bus, he doesn't shift blame, he steps up and says, "This is on me, let's learn from it and move forward." And in a world of leaders who too often protect their image at the cost of their people, that simple act of owning mistakes becomes radical, and it begins to win over those who were unsure about him. By the time they reach the final stage of the competition, when they're up against other powerful tech groups, including maybe remnants of the old Perkasa structure now under Sanjaya's influence, the team's trust in Sutanto isn't blind. It's been tested in the fire of late nights, tight deadlines, and shared setbacks. So when he tells them before the final presentation that they did everything the right way, his words carry weight, not because he's making a moralistic speech, but because they've lived that right way with him over weeks and months. This idea of the right way is one of the film's most important thematic pillars, because it pushes back gently, but firmly, against the cynical notion that ethics and success are always in conflict. Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is not naive, it shows us clearly how those who cheat, exploit, or betray can indeed gain power, at least for a while. But it also insists that success built on rotten foundations will eventually rot from the inside, that there is a cost to everything, and that the most sustainable achievements are those that don't require you to sacrifice your soul. Beyond the big plot points and moral arcs, though, some of the film's most affecting work is done through small, almost throwaway details. Take the workers of Grup Perkasa, for example, who could easily have been reduced to a faceless crowd, a single symbol of the people harmed by corporate greed. Instead, we meet a few of them individually over the course of the film. The older security guard who always greeted Sutanto each morning and now stands outside the closed building, uniform slightly wrinkled, unsure of where to go next. A young single mother from accounting who shares a quiet scene at a food stall, counting coins for her meal, telling a friend she's not sure how she'll pay next month's rent. A technician who used to love his job because he believed Perkasa wasn't just another company, because he believed in Sutanto as more than just a name on his payslip. These small moments build a mosaic of human lives impacted by the collapse, making it impossible to see the bankruptcy as just a business event. And when Sutanto later makes it a priority, through the Laksana Simmering partnership, to start setting aside funds to pay back wages, those faces are the ones we remember. Those are the people he is silently working for, beyond his own pride. And that decision, to prioritize his former employees even after being betrayed and stripped of his company, speaks volumes about his character, again reinforcing the idea that for him, leadership has never been just about profit margins, but about stewardship, about the human beings whose lives rise and fall with the decisions made in those sleek boardrooms. That sense of stewardship is passed down, in a way, to Demas as well, who watches all of this unfold and internalizes it. You can almost imagine that, years from now, even when Sutanto is no longer actively in the picture, Demas will carry forward that ethos into future projects, into how he treats his own employees, and that's one of the movie's quietest, most hopeful messages, that the legacy of kindness is not always a monument with someone's name on it, it's often just a way of doing things that outlives the person who started it. Switching back for a moment to the legal reckoning subplot, another aspect worth talking about is how the movie portrays justice as a process, not a moment. Many stories love the big dramatic scene where the villain is exposed and dragged away, crowds cheering, everything resolved in a single cathartic beat. But Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas gives us the slow burn, auditors poring over documents, whistleblowers giving hesitant testimony, news articles trickling out, public opinion slowly shifting from blaming Sutanto to questioning the narrative they were fed. At first, there's a sense that the world is happy to believe that he mismanaged the company, that he's just another failed executive, because that's a simple story. But as more details emerge, that story becomes harder to sustain, and even those who once gossiped about him start to reconsider. There's a scene where a former colleague of Sutanto, a man who initially distanced himself to save his own skin, is sitting in front of a TV watching a news report about the ongoing investigations into Sanjaya and the board, and you see the slow realization dawning on his face that he abandoned the wrong person, that he chose convenience over loyalty, and the bitterness in his eyes is not just about Sanjaya's lies, but about his own weakness. The film doesn't necessarily show him getting a full redemption arc, but that small moment of self-recognition adds another layer to the story's exploration of betrayal and integrity. And as for Sanjaya's actual endgame, the legal consequences aren't just about him going to jail or paying fines, they're about the complete dismantling of the life he built on treachery. We see investors withdrawing, his allies turning their backs, his name becoming toxic in circles that once celebrated him, and in one of his final scenes, perhaps in a stark, sterile interrogation room, or waiting alone in a hallway outside a courtroom, the confident mask finally drops. He's just a man sitting with the weight of what he's done, and while the movie doesn't ask us to feel sorry for him, it does invite us to reflect on how different things might have been if he had chosen gratitude over greed, collaboration over conquest. Some viewers might wonder, why doesn't the film give us a direct confrontation between Sutanto and Sanjaya, something where Sutanto finally gets to say everything to his face? And the answer, I think, lies in the film's commitment to a particular kind of emotional truth. In real life, closure rarely comes in grand, perfectly scripted moments. Often, justice and healing happen in separate rooms, on different days, through processes that never give you that perfect speech. Giving Sutanto a big showdown with Sanjaya would have been satisfying on a surface, cinematic level, but it might have cheapened the deeper point the movie is making, that Sutanto's real victory is not in crushing his enemy with words, but in simply living well in spite of what was done to him, in refusing to let that betrayal dictate the rest of his life. And in that sense, the scene of Sutanto merely glimpsing Sanjaya from a distance, being led into his legal reckoning, is more powerful than any shouted accusation could have been, because it shows that their paths have diverged so completely that they are no longer even inhabiting the same moral universe. Circling back to the emotional heart once more, let's talk more about the presence and absence of Sutanto's mother, because in many ways she is the soul of the film. Even though she spends most of it in a hospital bed or in a small, modest house, she represents the original source of Sutanto's values, the living proof that his kindness, his sense of responsibility, didn't come from thin air but was taught, modeled, maybe even sometimes enforced by a woman who believed deeply that how you treat others is more important than what you own. Her line about kindness being worth gold isn't just a sweet thing a mother says, it's the distillation of her entire worldview, and in their scenes together we get a glimpse of who Sutanto is when he's not wearing the boss mask, the son, still seeking comfort, still wanting to protect her from the ugliest parts of his life, when she dies, quietly, gently, but with so much emotional force rippling outward. The movie doesn't exploit that moment for shock, it allows it to become a kind of pivot point inside Sutanto. Up until then, part of his drive has been to fix everything so that he won't disappoint her, to restore what was lost before she has to know the full extent of the chaos. but when she's gone, there's a moment where he almost loses his reason to keep going, as if the last anchor has been cut, and here, again, the film could have taken a darker path, showing him spiral into despair, but instead, after a period of mourning, of visible exhaustion, it shows him returning to her words, almost like a mantra, and choosing to live in a way that honors her not by magically fixing everything, but by embodying the virtue she cherished most. We see this in small, tender gestures after her death. A scene where he watches a tired cashier at a small store and decides to pay a bit extra and tells her to keep the change, even though his own finances are sharply limited now. A scene where a neighbor's child needs help with schoolwork, and despite everything on his plate, Sutanto sits with him at the kitchen table and explains a difficult concept with patience. These details might seem unrelated to the main plot, but they're essential to the film's emotional integrity because they show that his goodness is not just an identity he puts on when it's convenient. It's his instinct even when no one is watching, even when he has nothing material to gain. And that's the heart of the title, really. Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas, goodness of heart is worth gold, not because it guarantees you wealth or protects you from suffering, but because when everything else is stripped away, it's the one treasure you still have, the one thing that can't be stolen. Stylistically, the film supports these themes with a pacing and visual language that may challenge viewers who are used to quicker, snappier storytelling. There are long takes where the camera simply watches a character sit with their thoughts, scenes where not much happens on the surface, but emotionally, everything is happening: grief, regret, resolve, fear. These quiet moments are where the performances really shine, because they ask the actors to communicate without the safety net of big speeches, relying instead on body language, on the way a hand lingers on a doorframe, or how a breath catches before a character answers a question. For some audiences, especially those who crave constant stimulation, these choices might feel slow, but for many others, they will feel like a breath of honesty in a medium that too often rushes from one plot point to the next. And if we pull back and think about the cultural context of this movie, the timing of its 2025 release, it's hard not to see it as part of a larger conversation in Indonesia, and beyond, about what kind of society we are building in the wake of rapid globalization and technological change. The chip competition plotline isn't just there to be trendy or futuristic, it's a symbol of how much modern economies rest on invisible, hyper-technical work, microchips that power our devices, the unseen infrastructure behind the glossy screens we stare at all day, and the movie juxtaposes that cutting-edge technology with very old questions. How do we treat the workers who make this progress possible? What values guide our leaders as they pursue innovation? Are we okay with a world where brilliance is rewarded even when it's ruthless, where success stories are built on the silent suffering of others? By rooting those questions in a deeply human story of one man, one family, one company, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas avoids becoming a lecture and instead becomes an invitation. Look closely at the systems around you, look at the people who have quietly done right by you, look at the ways you might one day use your own power, however limited or great. And as the final scenes unfold, with Sutanto beginning his new chapter at Grup Laksana, with the strategic partnership with Grup Simmering taking shape, with the first wave of restitution finally reaching some of the former Perkasa employees, there's a sense of cautious hope, not the naive, everything is fixed kind of hope, but the grounded, fragile, yet persistent kind. You know that there are still challenges ahead, that public opinion doesn't flip overnight, that new business ventures can always fail, that sorrow and injustice will exist alongside kindness and justice, but you also know that one man's choice to remain kind, even after being broken, has already changed more lives than he'll ever fully realize. And that's why, when the credits begin to roll, you don't just walk away thinking, that was a sad but uplifting story. You walk away with the more uncomfortable but necessary question: if I were in the shoes of Sutanto's children, or Sanjaya, or even one of those skeptical Laksana board members, what choices would I have made? And in my own, much smaller, everyday life, who have I quietly betrayed by taking their kindness for granted? And who, on the other hand, do I owe a debt of gratitude to, a debt maybe not of money, but of respect, support, and remembering? In that way, Kebaikan Hati Bernilai Emas is less a film you simply watch and more a mirror you stand in front of, and the longer you look, the more you see, not just its characters, but yourself, your culture, your values, your fears. And if that yes you gave at the beginning of this continuation comes from a place of recognizing even a small piece of yourself in this story, then my hope is that revisiting it in this deeper way has given you something more than just a recap or analysis, that it's maybe sparked a thought, a memory, a quiet resolve, because in the end, movies like this aren't about the size of the company on the billboard or the specifics of chip technology, they're about the universal, timeless battle inside every human heart.